I have not opened that door in 81 years. That is not a figure of speech. That is not the kind of thing a man says when he means he has been cautious, or careful, or reluctant to let the world in. I mean the door. The actual door, with its brass handle and its 3 deadbolts and the length of naval rope I looped through the handle bracket in 1947, when I decided the bolts alone were not enough. I have not opened it. The room service trays come through a slot at the bottom. There is a slot. There has always been a slot, and I long ago stopped wondering who cuts the slot and who slides the trays, and what they make of the pair of boots they can see parked on the floor 6 inches from the opening. The boots are Regulation Navy, 1943 issue. They have been resold twice by a cobbler who works somewhere in this building, who slid a note through my slot once saying he would do the work if I left the boots there on a Wednesday morning. I did. He did. We have never spoken. That is the kind of relationship that suits me. My name is Davy Jonas. I was a petty officer 2nd class aboard the submarine USS Baden, a Gato-class fleet boat out of Pearl Harbor, and I was 23 years old when the Baden went down in the Pacific in the autumn of 1943. The official record says I went down with her. The official record is almost right. What actually happened is a longer story, and it involves the hotel and what the hotel is, and why a man can seal himself in a room for 81 years and still be 23 years old when he looks in the mirror. I will get to that. I want to get to it properly, because the night I am going to tell you about deserves to be set up right. That night changed everything. That 81 years of silence had settled into something like permanence. And if I am going to explain why a woman knocked on my door, and why I answered it and what happened after, I need you to understand what this hotel is and what I became inside it. The hotel exists between places. That is the simplest way I can say it, and it took me about 10 years of listening through the wall to arrive at that simplicity. It sits at the edge of something, a fold, a seam, a place where the orderly fabric of where things are develops a loose thread. Ships have always found such places. Sailors have always known, in the way that you know things when you are far enough from land and the stars are wrong, that the ocean has rooms in it that do not appear on any chart. The Baden found one. Most of the crew went down with the boat when the seam closed again. I had been on the sail at the wrong moment, and the seam deposited me, soaking and bewildered, in the parking lot of this hotel at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. A man at the front desk gave me a key. He did not ask questions. He had the look of a man who had stopped asking questions a long time ago. I walked up 2 flights of stairs, found room 217, and I have not left it since. The aging is simple once you accept what the hotel is. Time inside the seam does not accumulate the way time does outside it. I do not fully understand the mechanism. What I understand is the result. I was 23 when I walked in, and I am 23 when I look in the mirror each morning, and the mirror has not lied to me once in 81 years. The room service trays come. The boots get resold. The newspapers slide through the slot when I request them, and I read them cover to cover and try to hold the shape of the world in my mind even though I am not in it. Because a man who stops trying to understand what is happening outside his door is already dead, and I have made a private decision not to be dead. That decision required more maintenance than I expected. In the first decade I tried to keep naval rhythms, watch schedules, morning drills, the careful logging of observations that sonar duty had trained into me. I built a logbook out of the newspaper margins. I tracked weather patterns mentioned in the papers and mapped them against the faint pressure changes I could feel in the building's air system when the external climate shifted. I cataloged the sounds of the hotel, the frequency and timing of the elevator, the pattern of cleaning crews, the acoustic signature of different types of guests moving through the corridors. A man alone in a sealed room is in danger of 2 things. The first is despair. The second is a quieter thing, harder to name, a kind of softening of the mind, a tendency to stop making fine distinctions, because fine distinctions require contact with the world, and contact with the world requires risk. I fought that softening the way I had fought the Pacific, with attention, with discipline, with the stubborn conviction that the instruments are only as good as the man reading them. I know what the hotel hosts. I know because the walls are thin and my hearing is good, and 81 years is a long time to listen. The guests are not always human. They are not often human, in fact. The hotel serves as a transit point, a layover, a stopping-off place, for travelers moving between what I understand to be adjacent versions of the real. Most of them are quiet. Some of them are not. In 1968, something very large occupied the room directly above mine for 11 days. And during those 11 days, the ceiling flexed slightly with each of its steps, and the light fixture swung in a slow pendulum arc that made sleep difficult. In 1981, a group of beings I never saw but could smell, a clean, cold smell like the inside of a watch, occupied the room next door for 3 weeks and had conversations in a frequency that sat just at the edge of what a human ear can process, so that I lived those 3 weeks with a faint, persistent headache that felt like conscience. I have heard weeping. I have heard laughter at pitches no human throat produces. I have heard what I can only describe as singing that came from inside the walls themselves, not from any room but from the building's structure, as though the building occasionally needed to remember what it was. None of them knocked on my door. Not once in 81 years did any guest of this hotel knock on my door. The other rooms turned over, I could hear the comings and goings, but room 217 was apparently noted in whatever directory the hotel maintains as occupied, permanent, do not disturb. I was grateful for that. I had come to regard my sealed room the way a sailor regards a good ship. It was a platform, it was survival, it was mine. I had my newspapers. I had the trays. I had a shortwave radio I had assembled from components requested through the slot over a period of years, and on that radio I could pick up, depending on the night, broadcasts from frequencies that did not correspond to any human station. I listened to those broadcasts the way a man listens to the sea, not for information exactly, but for the assurance that something large and complex was still out there, still moving, still indifferent to him in the specific way that large things are indifferent to small things, which is to say not hostile, merely occupied with its own vastness. The shortwave was the thing that kept me sharpest. There was a standard frequency range, and below it there was another range, and below that another, and the radio could reach them all if you modified the tuning mechanism with a precision that took me 3 years to achieve using only what I could request through the slot. Once I had it working properly, I began the serious work of cataloging what was down there. Non-human broadcasts had signatures the way ships have signatures, not identical, but characteristic. Once you knew what you were listening for, you could learn to distinguish them. There were 8 or 9 regular sources that I eventually mapped. Some were purely instrumental carrier tones, navigation beacons, the kind of signal that is not communication but position marking, a way of saying here in a frequency that most things can't hear. Others were clearly communicative, though I could only catch the structure and never the content. And then there were the Vorrkai. The Vorrkai were the most interesting because they were the most deliberate. Their signals had a mathematical quality that human radio never fully achieved, a base 12 structure that was internally consistent in a way that suggested a species that had developed mathematics before language, or alongside it, so that the two were not separable in the way they sometimes are in human thinking. I had been listening to their carrier frequency for perhaps 6 years before I began to suspect that it was not merely a carrier, that the base 12 sequence had overtones that varied in ways too regular to be noise. That was when I started keeping very careful notes. That was when the newspaper margins became the most important documents in room 217. I was listening to the radio on the night of the knock. It was late by the clock on my wall, which I have kept wound and accurate because a sailor keeps time. That is not optional. That is what you do. The broadcast I had found was something I had encountered twice before over the years. A low modulated pulse with harmonic overtones, the Vorrkai diplomatic carrier signal, running cleaner and more distinct than usual, which meant the transit group was closer to the hotel than they typically were at this hour. I knew the Vorrkai the way I knew all the regular guests, by sound, by smell, by the particular way their presence altered the air pressure in the corridor outside my door. The Vorrkai were a tall species, silver-skinned, and they moved with a precise, unhurried weight that I had learned to recognize through the floor. They came through the hotel perhaps once every 4 or 5 years, always a formal party, a diplomatic transit, I gathered, between wherever they were going and wherever they had been. They were not hostile. They were simply entirely uninterested in anything that was not Vorrkai. The transit party had arrived 2 hours earlier than usual. I had marked that in the margin of tonight's paper, a 2024 newspaper, its news about things I could map onto 40 years of context, and noted that the group sounded larger than usual. 10 members at minimum, possibly 12. They had moved through the corridor with the standard Vorrkai precision, though I had caught in the texture of their movement a slight irregularity. One of the party was walking differently from the rest. Not impaired, differently. A slightly more variable rhythm, the kind of walk that belongs to a person who is thinking about something other than walking. I had noted that as well. In 32 years of tracking Vorrkai transit parties through this building, I had heard that particular walk before, and always in the same member of the party. I had never been able to determine her specific role. I knew only that she was not moving with the formal precision of the court's full diplomatic formation, and that she consistently positioned herself at the trailing edge of the group, and that twice in the last several transits she had paused outside my door for 3 or 4 seconds before the group moved on. She had paused longer tonight. I had been tracking her through the floorboards, the small precise pressure of her weight, and she had stood outside room 217 for perhaps 15 seconds before the group reached the end of the corridor. Then she had walked back. I was tracking the carrier signal, making notes in the margin of the newspaper when the knock came. 3 knocks, solid, deliberate, evenly spaced. Not a maintenance knock, which is one flat thump, not the accidental brush of a passing body against the door. 3 knocks with a closed fist, the way a person knocks when they intend for you to hear them and intend for you to know they meant it. I put down the pencil. I had not heard a knock on that door since 1947, when the previous desk clerk, a small nervous man named Ferd, had knocked to tell me that a guest in the corridor was distressed and asking for assistance, and I had told him through the door that I was not available and he should find someone else, and he had said there was no one else, and I had said I was sorry, but that did not change my answer. He had gone away. The distressed guest had eventually quieted. I had not asked what happened. You learn in a sealed room that there are questions you do not allow yourself to ask because the answers would make staying sealed impossible. But this knock was different from Ferd's knock. This knock was not apologetic. This knock was curious. I sat with it for a moment. The shortwave signal pulsed. My pencil lay in the margin of the 2024 newspaper. Outside, very faintly, I could hear the precise, unhurried weight of Vorrkai feet moving in the corridor. More than the usual transit group, I thought, maybe 10 or 12 of them, and they were positioned along the corridor rather than moving through it, which was unusual. They were waiting. The knock came again, 3 knocks, same cadence, same force, patient. I stood up. That was not a decision I made consciously. My body made it, which surprised me, because my body had been perfectly content to remain seated for 81 years, and now here it was, standing, moving toward the door. I did not open it. I put my hand on the handle, my right hand, the one with the white scar from the Baden's last dive, the one that still aches in cold water, though there is no cold water in room 217. There hasn't been since they improved the plumbing in 1961. And I said, through the wood, Who's there? A pause, then a voice. Female, I thought, though the Vorrkai register is lower than a human female voice. A resonance rather than a pitch, something you feel in the chest before you hear it properly. I am told this room has been occupied for 80 of your years, she said. I wanted to know what kind of being stays in a room for 80 years. The kind that values his privacy, I said. Another pause. Then, that is a deflection, not an answer. I took my hand off the handle and stood with my back against the door and thought about that. She was right. It was a deflection. I had spent 81 years perfecting my deflections, layering them until they were as solid as the deadbolts, and she had identified mine in 4 words. What kind of being knocks on a door that has been sealed for 80 years? I said. One who was dared to, she said, and one who, having accepted the dare, found herself actually curious. There was something in that answer that I had not heard in a very long time. Not in the broadcasts on the shortwave, not in the newspapers, not in the rare snatches of corridor conversation that came through the walls. What I heard in that answer was honesty. Not diplomacy, not performance. The Vorrkai were famous, even in the shortwave broadcasts, for their diplomacy, their layered formal speech, their precise calibrated courtesy. This was not that. This was a being saying the true thing without dressing it. What is your name? I said. Johnny Ray, she said. Second born to the Vorrkai Queendom, 7th in the line of the ascending court. A pause. And also the one who lost a bet to her chamberlain, and so here I am. I almost smiled. I had not almost smiled in a long time. Davy Jonas, I said. Petty Officer 2nd Class, USS Baden, United States Navy, 1943. I put my hand back on the handle. I have not opened this door in 81 years. I know, she said. That is why I knocked. I opened the door. She was tall. I had expected that the Vorrkai, as I had understood them from their sounds and their carrier signals and the occasional references in the shortwave broadcasts, were tall. But tall is a word that doesn't do the work required of it here. She stood in my doorframe, and her head was perhaps 8 inches from the top of it, and she was lean in the way that things built for efficiency are lean, nothing wasted, every line serving a purpose. Her skin was the color of old silver, not the bright silver of new metal, but the muted silver of something that has been handled and breathed on and carried through weather, a silver that had depth to it, that shifted slightly when she moved. Her eyes were dark and very large, the irises filling almost the entire visible eye, and they caught the light from my room in a way that made them look briefly, startlingly alive. She wore a formal garment, dark layered fabric with a collar that rose to her jaw, and at her throat there was an insignia I recognized from the shortwave broadcasts as Vorrkai court rank. Behind her, in the corridor, I could see the rest of them. 10 of them, in formal transit dress, all taller than human average, all silver, all watching with expressions that I could not read but that felt, somehow, like the expression of people who have just watched someone do something they were absolutely certain could not be done. She looked at me, I looked at her. She was taking inventory, I realized, the same way I had taken inventory of her. Her eyes moved from my face to my hands to my boots to the room behind me, methodical and unhurried. "You are young," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "I was 23 in 1943, I said. "The room doesn't age me." "The transit property," she said. "I had read about it in the hotel's documentation, but I had assumed it was an exaggeration." She looked at me again. "You are not an exaggeration." "Come in," I said. I don't know why I said it. It was the most natural sentence I had spoken in 81 years, and it terrified me. She glanced back at the 10 members of her court. Something passed between them, not speech, not quite, but the Vorrkai had, I gathered, a secondary communication channel that operated below the audible range. One of the court members, taller than the rest, with a collar insignia that suggested seniority, made a gesture that I read, across all the barriers of biology and culture, as, "This is a terrible idea." Johnny Ray stepped into my room. I closed the door. She stood in the center of my room and looked at the newspapers stacked in their careful columns, organized by year and folded so their margins showed my notes. At the shortwave radio on the table, its dial set to the Vorrkai carrier frequency it had been on when she knocked. At the narrow bed against the wall with its navy blanket, regulation, which I had asked for through the slot in 1944, and which the cobbler, or someone like the cobbler, someone who worked in the building and understood requests, had provided. At the window, which looked out onto an airshaft and admitted a narrow column of light that was not quite daylight and not quite artificial, the kind of light that the hotel produced in its intermediate spaces. "You have made this bearable," she said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation, said with something that sounded like respect for the amount of work it had required. "A sailor keeps his ship," I said, "even when the ship is a room." She turned to look at the radio. "That is our carrier signal," she said. "I know. I have been tracking your transits for about 40 years. You come through every 4 or 5 years, 8 to 10 members in the transit group usually. You stay between 18 and 22 hours. I paused. "I did not know one of you would knock." "Neither did I," she said. I offered her the chair. I had one chair, a good one, solid wood, which I had acquired through the slot in 1952 by the simple method of writing a note that said I needed a chair and leaving it there until something happened. She looked at it and sat, folding herself into it with a precision that suggested she was unaccustomed to human-scale furniture, but was not going to allow that to show. I sat on the edge of the bed. We regarded each other across maybe 4 feet of floor. "How long do you have?" I said. "The transit window opens in approximately 7 of your hours," she said. "After that, I must pass through with the court or wait the full cycle." 4 or 5 years, I said. "Yes. That's a long time to miss a window." "It is," she said, and did not move. I could hear the court outside. They had not left, which I had half expected. They were stationed along the corridor in what I now recognized was a formation, not waiting exactly, but maintaining, keeping watch. The senior court member's presence was a solid pressure through the wall, patient and disapproving in equal measure. "They don't like this," I said. "Carl Ray never likes anything that was not part of the original itinerary," she said. "That is what makes him an excellent chamberlain." A pause. "He is also my elder brother." "Protective." "Correct." She looked at the newspapers. "May I?" I nodded. She reached for the nearest stack, 2024, the margins dense with notes on the Vorrkai carrier signal variations I had tracked through the year, and held it at an angle to catch the light. She was reading the margins, not the news. "You have been studying our transmission protocols," she said. 40 years of free time and a shortwave radio," I said. "A man has to do something." She set the papers down and reached for another stack. This one was older, 1989, the year I had first identified the pattern at position 7 of the sequence. Her fingers moved carefully through the folded pages, and I watched her read my notation system with the same methodical attention she had given the room when she first entered. She was building a picture. That was what good analysts did. They built pictures from fragments. They held partial images until the missing pieces arrived and the whole thing resolved. "You have correctly identified 3 variations in the carrier that our own signals engineers have attributed to hardware drift. They are not hardware drift. They are encoding shifts." She looked at me steadily. "You are the first non-Vorrkai to identify this." "I had more time than your signals engineers," I said. "Time is not sufficient. Aptitude is required as well." She tilted her head. "You said you were a sailor." "A naval rating. Petty officer 2nd class, sonar. I listened for a living." "And now you listen from a sealed room." Same job, I said, different ocean. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Carl Ray shifted his weight in a way that sent a small vibration through the floor. I had spent 81 years learning to read this building through its vibrations, and what I read from Carl Ray's shift was impatience settling into something harder, something that was preparing to act. He is going to knock, I said. He is, she agreed. I have perhaps 20 minutes before his sense of protocol overrides his sense of courtesy. Then I'll ask you something I've been wondering for 40 years, I said. Your carrier signal, the encoding shifts. They are not random and they are not hardware. They are a message. The same base 12 sequence repeating with a variation at position 7 each transit. I have never been able to identify what varies at position 7. She looked at me for a long moment. The dark irises of her eyes were very still. Position 7 is the regent key, she said quietly, the identifying signature of whoever is authorizing the transit. It changes every transit. Yes, the regent key rotates with each secondary cycle of court authority. It would change when a new authorizing member of the ascending court takes precedence. And in the last 40 years it has rotated 6 times, I said, but the base sequence never changed. The base sequence is the queendom, she said. It does not change. We sat with that. The queendom does not change. I understood what she meant in a way that surprised me, not because it was alien to me, but because it wasn't. The queendom was the hull. The hull does not change. The crew rotates, the mission changes, the boat surfaces and dives and surfaces again, but the hull is the hull. You trust the hull or you do not go to sea. I have been doing the same thing, I said, for 81 years, holding position. Waiting for orders. I thought about that. Waiting for something to make sense, I said. Waiting for the situation to develop to a point where a correct action is identifiable. And has it? You knocked on the door, I said. That was the first new data point in 81 years. She smiled. I had not been sure the Vorrkai smiled. The broadcast had not prepared me for it, but she smiled, and it was small and wry and entirely readable across everything that separated us. I am poor data, she said. You are the best data I have, I said. Carl Ray knocked. 3 measured taps, harder than his sister's, with the authority of a man who had spent his career knocking on doors that opened immediately. Johnny Ray closed her eyes briefly, opened them. I am going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to tell me if it is impertinent. Ask. Is this what you chose, this room, this sealed life? She gestured at the newspapers, the radio, the navy blanket on the bed. Or is this what happened to you and you made the best of it? No one had asked me that. Not Ferd, not the cobbler, not anyone in 81 years. The question sat in the room like a third person. Both, I said. It happened to me, and then I chose it, because the alternative was trying to walk out that door into a world that had moved 80 years without me, and I didn't know how to do that. You were afraid. I was practical, I said. Fear and practicality look a lot alike from the inside. They do, she said. I know something about that. Carl Ray knocked again, harder. She stood up. She was very tall in my room, silver and formal and composed, and she looked at the door and then back at me. I am the second-born, she said. In the Vorrkai ascending court, the second-born has no function in the formal succession. There is a role prepared for the second-born diplomatic envoy, the perpetual transit, the representative who is everywhere and therefore committed to nothing. I have been performing that role for 11 of your years. She paused. I was not afraid of the dare. I was grateful for the dare. I stood up. My room was small and we were perhaps 3 feet apart. Because it gave you a reason to knock, I said. Because it gave me a reason to knock on something real, she said. Carl Ray's voice came through the door, low and precise and in Vorrkai formal register, which I had learned well enough over 40 years to catch the edges of. He was noting the time. He was noting the transit window. He was noting that the second-born's absence from the court formation was a diplomatic irregularity that he was required to formally register. He's going to keep registering it until you come out, I said. Yes, she did not move toward the door. You have 7 hours, I said. 6.5 now. Then sit down, I said, and tell me what position 7 of the Regent key sounds like when it's yours. She looked at me for a moment that stretched. Outside, Call Ray had stopped knocking. That was not reassurance. That was Call Ray deciding that formal knocking was insufficient and considering alternatives. She sat down. She told me. The next 6 hours were the most fully inhabited hours I had spent in 81 years. We talked about sonar, about what listening is as a discipline, what you train yourself to hear and what you train yourself not to hear, because hearing everything is not the skill. The skill is triage, is knowing which sound in the dark ocean of noise is the one that matters. The Vorrkai had an equivalent practice, she told me. The ascending court spent years learning to hear the difference between the Queendom signal and the ambient noise of the universe. Most of the court learned to hear it as a tone. She had always heard it as a rhythm. Rhythm is more reliable, I said. Tone drifts, rhythm is structural. That is what I told my tutors, she said. They were not convinced. Tutors are rarely convinced by the student who is right before they're supposed to be. She laughed. It was a sound I had not been braced for, low and genuine and briefly unguarded, and it hit me the way cold water hits you when the hull is breached. Sudden, total, clarifying. We talked about the hotel. She knew more about its mechanics than I did. The Vorrkai had used it as a transit point for longer than humans had known it existed, and their records on the building's properties were extensive. She told me things I had spent 81 years guessing at. The transit property was not unique to room 217. It was a gradient, strongest at the center of the building, weakening toward the exterior. I was in a strong zone. The desk clerk, she said, had known. He had given me room 217 specifically. Why, I said. The hotel persists because its long-term residents anchor it, she said. You are part of the building's stability mechanism. You and 3 or 4 others like you in different rooms in different centuries. You hold the seam open. I sat with that for a while, 81 years of sealed room solitude as structural load-bearing. There was something almost funny in it. Almost. I didn't volunteer for that, I said. No, she said, I don't think the hotel asks. Do you trust it, the building? She considered. I trust that it has interests. I trust that its interests and mine have not, so far, been incompatible. She looked at me steadily. I trust that it gave you room 217 and that you have kept it for 81 years, and that those 2 facts mean something, though I cannot tell you precisely what. We talked about the war. She asked, with the directness I had come to expect from her in the hours since she sat down, what it had been like to be in a machine designed for silence, moving through an ocean that was trying to kill you. I told her about sonar duty, about the particular quality of attention required, the way you learn to inhabit the sound completely, not to interpret from outside it but to be inside it, to let the sound tell you what it was rather than deciding what it should be. I told her about the physicality of it that people never understood unless they had done it. The headphones and the cold metal stool, and the way the hull magnified every sound from the water and translated it into information that was also noise. And you had to separate them in real time, under pressure, while men's lives sat in the balance of your ability to make that separation correctly. That is a significant responsibility for someone so young, she said. I was trained for it, I said. The Navy trained you for it and then you did it. That was the deal. I paused. The Baden had a good crew. The training held because the crew held. Tell me about them, she said. I told her about the Baden's crew. Rufus Bass, the machinist's mate who could hear a bearing failure before any instrument registered it, who had his hand on every piece of moving machinery in that both the way Some men have their hand on a horse's flank, feeling what the animal is telling you before it tells you in words you can understand. Rufus had saved the bodden twice before we went down. Both times the instrument boards showed nothing. Both times Rufus Bass said something quiet to the chief, and 20 minutes later the gauges confirmed what Rufus had already known. Al Sharko, the torpedo man who narrated baseball games from memory to keep the crew calm during deep dives. He had memorized over the course of his life something like 40 complete games, pitch by pitch, at bat by at bat, the way a musician memorizes a score. When the hull was ticking and pressing and the lights were dimmed for depth, and the men who were not on watch had nothing to do but listen to the ocean trying to find a way in, Al Sharko would sit in the forward torpedo room and narrate a baseball game in the steady, unhurried voice of a man describing the weather. 1939 World Series. 1941 pennant race. He had specific preferences. He liked games with something at stake in the late innings, games where the outcome was uncertain deep into the ninth. He said there was no point narrating a blowout. You needed the tension. Tyrone Thaddeus, the cook. Tyrone produced meals from whatever was left in the stores with a cheerfulness that was not false, which was remarkable, because we were all aware of how bad things were, and Tyrone's cheerfulness was not the kind that pretends otherwise. It was the kind that knows and proceeds anyway. There is a difference, and it matters. A man who pretends things are fine is asking you to participate in a fiction that costs you energy to maintain. A man who knows things are bad and meets them with his chin up is giving you something to navigate by, a fixed point in the dark, and that costs him something real and he does it anyway. Tyrone was that. Every meal he produced was a small formal statement that we were still here, still eating, still people who could taste things and have preferences and put a good plate in front of another man and say, "This is for you, I made this, eat." She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You grieve them," she said. "Every day," I said. "And yet you stayed." "I couldn't get back to them," I said. "The Bodden is at the bottom of the Pacific. Going out that door didn't change that. At least in here." I stopped. "At least in here," she said. "Time moves slowly enough that they do not feel far away." I had not said that. I had never said that. But she had said it, and it was true, and I had been sitting with the truth of it for 81 years without being able to name it, and she had named it in 17 words. I did not answer. There wasn't an answer. There was just the fact of it sitting between us in the 4 feet of floor space. Outside, Call Ray had been quiet for 2 hours. That was the part that was worrying me, not his knocking but his silence. I had been tracking his weight through the floor the way I had tracked the Bodden's crew through bulkheads, the minute shifts that tell you what a person is doing when you can't see them. He had settled. He was not preparing to knock. He was preparing something else. "How does your court handle a diplomatic irregularity?" I said. She understood what I was really asking. "Formally," she said, "they would not force the door. That would be a violation of transit protocols. But when the transit window opens, they'd require you to be present." "They'd require me to be present," she confirmed. "And if you weren't, then I would not transit." A pause. "And then I would be stranded here until the next window." 4 or 5 years. 4 years and 8 months by the current cycle. We looked at each other. "What does the Vorrkai Queendom do with a second-born who misses a transit window?" I said. "Registers the irregularity," she said. "Sends a formal inquiry. Waits." Something shifted in her voice. "The Queendom is patient. It has been patient for longer than your species has kept records." "That's not an answer to my question." "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at the window, at the narrow column of not quite daylight. "The honest answer is that it depends on why the second-born missed the window. A second-born who misses a window due to incident or injury is recovered. A second-born who misses a window due to," she paused, choosing, "due to choice is reclassified." Reclassified as what? As having concluded the diplomatic envoy role. Another pause, which would leave me without a defined function in the ascending court. That sounds bad. It is considered dishonorable, she said quietly, by most of the court, by most of the queendom. She looked at her hands, long-fingered, silver still. My mother would understand. She has always understood things the court does not. But she's not here. No. Ray is here. I stood up, not because I had decided to do something, because I had been sitting with something for 6 hours that had the shape of a decision, and at some point a decision has to stand up or it isn't a decision at all, it's just thinking. He can't force the door, I said. No. And the transit window is in, I checked the clock, 40 minutes. Approximately. He's going to do something in those 40 minutes. Yes, she said. He will attempt to negotiate your cooperation. He will offer various incentives. He is a skilled diplomat. What kind of incentives does a Vorrkai chamberlain offer to a human sailor in a hotel room? I don't know, she said. You are an unusual case. He will improvise. She looked at me. You do not have to do anything, Davy Jonas. The choice is mine. Ray can negotiate all he likes, but I am the one in the room. You're in my room, I said. Yes. So he'll negotiate with me. Yes. I walked to the door, not to open it, not yet, just to stand with my hand on the handle, the way I had stood 6 hours ago when she first knocked, feeling the weight of what was on the other side of it. Johnny Ray, I said. Yes. In 40 years of tracking your carrier signal, I got very good at telling your court members apart by the sound of their weight on the floor. The transit parties are always 8 to 10, but in the last 6 transits, there was always one member of the group whose weight I couldn't place properly, lighter than the rest, more variable rhythm. Like someone who was thinking about something else while they walked. A pause. That was me, she said. I know, I said. I've known for about 30 years. Another pause, longer. You never knocked on the wall, she said. Neither did you. Ray knocked on the door. Not 3 knocks this time, 1. A single formal knock which the Vorrkai used, as I understood from the broadcasts, to signal the opening of a negotiation. I looked at the door, then I looked back at her. I'm going to tell him something, I said. And I want you to know I'm going to mean it before I say it, and that I'm not saying it because I've been in a room alone for 81 years and I've forgotten how to value myself correctly or how to calculate what's reasonable. I've had 81 years to think, which is more than most people get, and I know the difference between desperation and clarity. This is clarity. She was very still. She's mine now, I said, and I'm going to tell him that. The silence in the room was absolute. Johnny Ray sat in the single wooden chair and looked at me with those dark, fully open eyes, and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough that I had time to wonder if I had miscalculated everything, if 81 years of solitude had in fact broken my judgment in ways I couldn't perceive from the inside. Then she said, You should probably also tell him that you have been collecting intelligence on Vorrkai transit protocols for 40 years, and that you are willing to discuss the Regent key encoding in exchange for formal recognition of my right of extended diplomatic residence in a non-Vorrkai facility. I stared at her. That gives him something to bring back to the queendom, she said. Ray needs to be able to tell the court that he negotiated something. He cannot go home having simply been refused. Give him a negotiation. That's very practical, I said. I told you I was afraid and practical in equal measure. I turned back to the door and opened it. Ray was tall. He made his sister look approximately average, which meant he made me look like something a person might find on a low shelf. He was silver like her but brighter, less weathered, and his court insignia was elaborate in a way that communicated, across every barrier of culture, that he was accustomed to being taken seriously immediately. He looked at me the way I imagined he looked at most things, with a precise assessment that took perhaps 2 seconds and arrived at a conclusion he kept behind his eyes. Petty officer, he said. He had done research in 40 minutes. That was efficient. Chamberlain, I said. I hadn't been told his title, but I'd tracked his movements through enough transits to know his role from his position in the formation. We regarded each other. Behind me, Johnny Ray stood up from the chair. She did not move toward the door. She stood where she was, which was where she had chosen to be, and that was not a small thing. Your Queendom, I said to Call Ray, operates a transit carrier signal through this facility. I have been tracking that signal for 40 years. I have identified the Regent key encoding system, the base sequence structure, and 6 variations in the harmonic compression that your signals division has logged as unexplained anomalies. I am prepared to discuss my findings. I held his gaze. In exchange for formal Vorrkai recognition of the second-born's right of extended diplomatic residence at this facility. Call Ray was quiet for a moment. He was thinking. The quality of his thinking was visible in the way he held himself, not frozen but very still, the stillness of a machine in calculation. The Queendom does not negotiate with, he began. With humans, I said. I know, but the Queendom does negotiate with intelligence assets, and that's what I'm offering. 40 years of uninterrupted signals observation from a fixed point inside the transit facility. Your own ships are moving when they pass through. I'm not moving. You've been flying past a perfect listening post for 40 years without knowing it. I paused. That's worth a diplomatic residence declaration, and you know it. He looked past me at his sister. She looked back at him with an expression I couldn't fully read, but which, from the way his jaw tightened, he could. It was, I thought, an expression that had a long history behind it. The accumulated weight of every time she had looked at him with that particular combination of resolve and apology, and he had chosen to read the resolve rather than the apology, because he loved her well enough to know which one mattered. The transit window opens in 31 minutes, he said. I know, I said. I cannot authorize a diplomatic residence declaration unilaterally. That requires the Queendom's formal council. Then authorize a provisional designation, I said. Pending council review, you have that authority. I know you do, because I tracked the Regent key rotation when provisional designations were authorized in 2008 and 2013, and the authorizing signature was yours both times. He looked at me with something that was not quite respect, but was its immediate neighbor. You have been a busy man for someone who never leaves his room, he said. I had good teachers, I said, and a lot of time. The 31 minutes passed in the corridor, with Call Ray making a formal communication through a device at his wrist that pulsed in the same base 12 sequence I had been tracking for 40 years. And me standing in my doorway for the first time in 81 years, feeling the corridor air on my face, which was not quite the air of any place I recognized, but was air, moving, real, carrying the faint, clean smell that I now associated with the Vorrkai, precise. Like the inside of a mechanism that has been well maintained. Johnny Ray stood at my shoulder and said nothing, and did not need to say anything. When Call Ray lowered his wrist, he looked at me with an expression I had spent the last 31 minutes learning to read. Provisional designation, he said. Extended diplomatic residence, facility liaison, signals consultation, pending formal council review at the next full transit. He paused. The next full transit is in 4 years and 8 months. I know, I said. He looked at his sister. Something passed between them in the secondary register below audible, felt in the chest. It was not short. When it ended, Call Ray straightened, and the court formation behind him straightened with him. He looked at me one more time, and in his expression there was something that I recognized from very specific moments in my naval service, moments when a superior officer had assessed a situation, and arrived at a conclusion that was not what he would have chosen, but that he would honor because it was the correct conclusion. It was the expression of a man who had gone looking for a problem and found, instead, something that demanded his respect. "The second-born remains," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not approval but was not the opposite of it either. "I will tell the Queendom that she is conducting preliminary liaison work." He looked at me. "I expect those signal files within the hour." "You'll have them before the transit window," I said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when a negotiation has concluded, and he is choosing to regard the outcome as acceptable. Then he turned and led his court down the corridor toward the transit point, 10 silver figures moving with the precise unhurried weight I had been tracking through the floor for 40 years, and they passed through a door at the end of the corridor, and the building settled back into its usual quiet. I stood in my doorway. Johnny Ray stood at my shoulder. 4 years and 8 months, she said. Approximately, I said. And then the formal council. And then the formal council. We stood there for a moment in the corridor. The not quite daylight came through the airshaft at the far end. The building breathed around us in its slow, structural way, holding the seam open the way it had held it open for 81 years, with me as one of its anchor points, which I had not chosen but which I had served, because a sailor serves his post whether or not he fully understood the posting at the time. "I should like to hear about Rufus Bass," she said, "and Al Sharko and Tyrone Thaddeus. You told me their names and their functions. I would like to hear the rest." "I told you about them," I said. "You told me what they did," she said. "I want to know who they were." I looked at her for a moment. She was right. There was a difference and she had heard it. I had given her the official record, name, rate, function. The same way the Navy kept records, accurate and incomplete in the way that all official records are incomplete, because official records are not built to hold the weight of a person. "That's a long story," I said. "We have 4 years and 8 months, she said, "provisionally." I looked down the corridor and then back at the door to room 217, which I had not seen from the outside in 81 years. It was a plain door. Brass handle, 3 deadbolts I had installed in stages between 1944 and 1950, a length of naval rope looped through the handle bracket. From the outside it looked like what it was, a door that someone had worked very hard to keep closed. I had come to that door in 1943 soaking wet and bewildered, handed a key by a man who didn't ask questions, and I had understood even then, in the way that you understand things before you have the words for them, that the door was going to be a test of something, of my ability to hold position without orders, to maintain function without purpose, to stay in contact with the shape of the world through the narrow instruments available to me. I had passed that test. I had passed it every day for 81 years, which was more days than most men get, and I had done it alone, which is the hardest way to pass any test. "Come back inside," I said. "I'll make some room." We went back in. I did not lock the deadbolts. Not because I had forgotten, but because I did not need to. The door was open inward in a way that had nothing to do with the hardware, and locking hardware against that kind of open would have been the work of a man who had not paid attention to the last 6 hours, and I had been paying attention to things through walls and bulkheads and sealed rooms for long enough to know when the real thing arrives. I told her about Rufus Bass, not the official version, not machinist's mate, bearing failures saved the boat twice, the real version. The version where Rufus Bass was from a small town in Mississippi and had never seen the ocean until he enlisted and spent his first 2 weeks at sea sick every morning, quietly and without complaint, before his body decided to accept the situation, and he became, without ceremony, the best listener in the submarine service. Where Rufus had a photograph of his mother in his breast pocket at all times, and the photograph had been in his breast pocket when we went down. Where Rufus Bass, in the last hour before the bottom met the seam, had put his hand on a fuel coupling that every instrument said was functioning normally, and had said to the chief, very quietly, that they needed to shut it down, and the chief had believed him, and they had shut it down, and the coupling had been cracked through, and that decision bought us 4 more hours. I told her about Al Sharko's baseball, and I told her the real thing about that too. Not just that it calmed the crew, but why it calmed the crew, which was that Al's voice in the dark was evidence that there existed a world beyond the hull, a world where men stood on green grass in summer light, and threw a ball at another man, and both of them were thinking about nothing more urgent than where the ball was going. Al carried that world inside him, and he gave it to us in the dark, when we needed to remember it existed. And I told her about Tyrone Thaddeus, about how Tyrone cooked, about the care he took, which was not the care of a man trying to impress anyone, but the care of a man who understood that food was an argument that life was worth the trouble, that a person deserved to eat something that tasted like something, that the fact of being alive in a dangerous place did not require you to eat as though you were already dead. Every meal Tyrone put in front of us was that argument made concrete, handed to you on a plate. She listened to all of it the way a person listens when they intend to carry it with them. When I finished, it was quiet. The shortwave radio on the table pulsed with a carrier signal I had been tracking for 40 years, and I finally understood what position 7 sounded like when it was hers. I had been hearing it as an anomaly for 30 years, a slight asymmetry in the base 12 pattern, a hesitation at the 7th position that I had never been able to explain because I had been trying to read it as code, as information, as something that meant something about the transit, about the queendom, about the mechanics of the building. It wasn't any of those things, it was her. It was the rhythm of a being who heard the queendom as a rhythm rather than a tone, and whose presence in the carrier signal expressed itself as a slight, characteristic pause at position 7, the place where her own rhythm and the queendom's rhythm met and negotiated. I had spent 30 years trying to decode it. It didn't decode. It just was. It was the sound of her. Outside, the building held the seam open. The transit window came and went, and the corridor was quiet. The shortwave pulsed. Room 217 held the same 4 walls and the same narrow column of not quite daylight and the same navy blanket on the bed, and none of that had changed, and all of it was different. A sailor holds his post. That is the first and last thing they teach you, before the instruments, before the procedures, before the chain of command and the regulations and all the formal machinery of naval service. Hold your post. Be where you are supposed to be when you are supposed to be there. Do the job that is assigned to you with the attention it deserves. I had held this post for 81 years. I had done the job that was assigned to me by a building that did not ask permission and did not offer explanations, and I had done it without knowing what the purpose was, which is in fact how most posts work. You are rarely given the full picture. You are given your station and your instruments and your instructions, and the larger purpose resolves itself, or it doesn't, and either way your job is to hold the station. The larger purpose had just walked through my door and sat down in my chair and asked me to tell her who Tyrone Thaddeus was, the real version. I am glad I did not stop listening. I am glad I did not stop.